All right, I'm Paul Cradle here with Indiana Man. Welcome, Pandooranauts. So we were just talking just before about we were talking about how to break an addiction cycle to various highly dopaminergic activities, such as we know the big ones. Probably shouldn't mention them here, precisely for that reason. There's a reason why the unmentionables are all in this category. So what happens is you'll have you'll have uh, you'll have a high, and then you'll have a low. And we were saying that you want to get through you want to learn how to deal. Is that how we put it? You want to learn how to deal with the lows. So, and on top of that, deal with the lows so that you won't want a high. I think we were saying that one of the reasons that you want another high is because you haven't learned to cope with the lows. And
Well,
and also beware of those things that will lead you to wanting a high that will kind of lure you in innocently enough. Like I was mentioning, a sneaky peek at I wouldn't say explicit material, but I sneaked peeks at some things that I don't need to look at. And it's like that can lead me astray unnecessarily because like the whole time that I was, just every once in a while peeking at stuff, it's like, well, I thought that it wouldn't lead me astray, but it actually, I think, contributed a great deal to leading me astray. So, was there something that you would like to add to that before we talk about what we were saying
yes.
about books? Go
Oh,
ahead.
yes. Uh, what led up to this was the mere discussion of reading a book and
Oh,
how innocent reading a book in today's society has become because it's just a simple thing between you and a page, no sound, no nothing, and how reading a book is so simple and so innocent, and it might also be a way to supply that addiction cycle that you might be trying to break of something else, and you could just be merely reading a book. Now sometimes people could say you're not accomplishing anything at all just by merely reading a book, but just like sleep, but at the same time it's not. Well, if reading a book is an addiction itself, then that's probably not a bad addiction unless it's material that could
yeah.
become harmful.
You know what? I don't think reading a book has ever been classified as addictive. I don't
Oh,
think
I
it's
has. I would beg to differ. I bet that I would like to think that some people are addicted to reading books.
that would be uncommon. Yeah, it's certainly not like you going into it like who are you most likely to find in an addiction clinic? Oh, that guy's in for books.
So
Not like
so but might I add, so Paul, now that being a given that this is what led up to our discussion about an addiction or an imbalance that is left over from what has just occurred in your life. So it could be emotional, it could be sexual, it could be, pardon my language, YouTube, it could be um drugs, it could be all that. It could be an addiction and an addiction of any kind, but it's how you come off of that low and what you do to to replace that high is
well,
that matter.
let me bring up another point, though. I think addiction is defined as well, there are a few factors in addiction. One is that you need increasingly more of the source to achieve the same effect. And another thing is, what's that? Your Coke?
Coca-Cola.
Yeah. And another thing is that you find it hard to stop using this source despite attempts to stop. Find it hard to stop despite attempts or intents to do so. However, there are very few people who have ever wanted to stop reading books, tried to stop reading books, and found themselves unable to do so because what they, and I think it has to be you trying to stop is difficult despite negative effects that it has, which would
Right.
be in the case of books hard to prove because books are so good to read, especially
Well,
older classics that,
depends on the material, Paul.
well, yeah, but especially now, women, here's, I see, maybe women and romance novels are kind of an addiction. It
Borderline. Yeah.
maybe depends on the
So,
material, but generally speaking, as long as you're not a woman, I think it'd be kind of hard to get addicted to romance. I mean, what kind of
I don't
what?
know.
I don't know, but I mean,
Urge to go pick
some
up a store novel and
I mean, some men are a little more turned on by a setting than others. Some are just purely visual. Oh, I want that body. And some are more like, I like this setting. But generally speaking, men are going to be like, it's going to be hard to addict a man to romance. But besides that, though, let's say that we're not women and we're not reading romance. What harm has ever come from books, reading
I,
good books? It's too
well,
good, isn't it, Indiana man? That's the thing.
yes,
Reading
but
books is too good. That's why people don't do it.
it is, Paul. But you're right. But as with any addiction, if it becomes an addiction that's harmful, it is taking away from the other things in everyday life. So if you're not
Oh,
participating in everyday events and routines, and it becomes
I see what you're saying. There could be some guy who just sits around and reads books all day.
all
That
day.
can be negative. Yeah, I can see how that. But it just so
So,
happened, though,
so
that there
Paul,
were riots
like
at the University of
Paul, just
Michigan.
mother, Paul, can I say something?
Yeah,
Just mother. I think the whole key here is what we're getting at here is everything in moderation. That's
in
what mom.
moderation. Yeah, yeah, in
Everything.
moderation. But yeah. Well, okay, I'll have a couple points on that. One thing is most people, you say moderation, but most people don't have any tolerance for reading a book at all. They just simply don't. Most people are nowhere near their book reading becoming a problem if they even do it. It would and it would be
Right.
it would be hard in today's society to think that you should only cautiously approach the hobby of book reading because it might interfere with other things I want to do. It would be hard to read a book to the detriment of the positive unfolding of your life. It's
Right.
very unlikely.
Can I
You would have
add to
to
that?
push yourself just to read enough
Can
coming
I
from
add to
where
Paul?
our society is. Yes.
Add another dimension to this, Paul. I don't think the that books becoming digital was I don't think the reason why books became digital was because they're harmful. I think it's actually the powers that be and the people in charge and the people who want to control the population said, "Hey, these books are terrible because they're educating the masses, and these books are awful because they're not harmful. These books are only good, so we're going to destroy them. And the only way to destroy books is to completely digitize them. That way, there's complete power and control over what the words are, what they say at any given moment. You can change them instantly on the internet or digitally.
Mm,
So and then it becomes the entertainment for the masses, so give them bread and entertainment and you can control the masses, and that's what it's all boiling down to. So I don't believe that books are a bad addiction, but I believe that somebody realized that and said, "Hey, we've got to do something about this because we're losing control of our population because books can become addicting, but there's nothing bad about them." So, in order to
Oh,
control the people, we have to introduce other addictions.
maybe, yeah, they introduced other addictions. They sprung things on the population so that they would stop reading books. That makes sense. Um,
Education.
yeah, they want to destroy the educational system, and I think they've done a very good job. Whoever wanted to destroy society, I think they did a good job with anything that makes it harder to read or begin reading or to finish a book. That's almost universally. I think that's a new mark, guide mark. How bad is something for society can be judged by how much does it make it harder for you to start reading, finish reading, or enjoy reading a book. That's it.
Right. Right.
Books are the guidepost. Being able to finish a book easily and enjoyably is the guidepost for how well you're doing, I believe, how good your
Yes,
attention
Paul.
span is, how good
It's
of a person you are,
yes, Paul. It's
intellectually, anyway. I mean, according
yes.
to your intellect, some people can't read very well, but if, I don't mean it that way, but according to your ability, according to your innate ability, how much you actually exercise that is how good of a person you are. I,
Yes, Paul. The different aspects of that are physical, whether it be a physical addiction, and then it physically gets in the way of you reading a book and makes you tired, so you're not going to pick up that book as fast the next day. Whether intellectually stimulating, addicting to where your mind and focus is on something else completely different. And then emotionally addicting, you're going to want to go do something else on that emotional level rather than read that book. There's so many different levels of distraction that would get in the way of you educating yourself by reading a book or simply just enjoying a pastime by reading that book that has introduced so many distractions that would get in the way of you reading that book. And I think they've become addictions
yeah.
that decrease the educational level of society and add
Yeah.
more control to the people with money and the power.
Well, take this as a case in point. Anybody who has control deleted the life of another person who wasn't reading a book at the time. Now, does 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 reading does committing adultery make it harder to read a book? Probably yes, because of all the planning and the time you're going to have to take out of your life. Does having marital relations typically pose that much of a problem for reading a book? Not really. I mean, you might be kind of tired, but generally speaking, if you're just
Paul,
having relations with a husband and wife, I mean,
it's been
like,
Paul. It's been that some married couples actually read the same book and then they talk about it together afterwards. It's actually an activity that a married couple can do. But anyway,
it can bring, that's right. If people have read or are reading the same book, it can actually bring them together. So it may even enhance marital relations. It may
mm-hmm.
even enhance, and marital relations may actually enhance book reading. Whereas, will adultery do that much? I guess you could meet some chick at the book club who, yes, I guess, but I don't typically hear about people getting it on with somebody they met at the book club. And
Oh,
but I see, but another thing is reading is so good though that I'm sure that women are not very attracted to the men who do it because they're not bad enough. And
right.
I
Doesn't
think that
yeah.
that is the main thing, probably that's one of the main drivers, I think, that leads men not to read because they know that women's know that it's good. So why would you want to do something good in the face of a woman when they want to see how bad you are? They want to see
Right.
how much you don't read books. They want and the yeah, go ahead, Indiana man.
Yes, Paul, it's because they've been influenced by the powers that be in society that make these addictions more alluring, easier. So it's easier to have an addiction than to sit down and read a book. Uh,
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. And then any I think almost any other addiction that I can possibly think of will make it harder for you to read or enjoy reading or start reading or finish reading a book.
yeah,
Absolutely.
and Paul, the feeling of accomplishment after you get done reading a book is probably not the same as going out and doing something like building something, taking a walk, talking to a relative. You're not going to feel like you've accomplished much after you read a book. You're going to have a feeling of enjoyment, maybe a rush of adrenaline, whatever it is,
Mm,
kind of chemical in your brain that's going to have that small feeling of accomplishment. But and I think that's why society has marked somebody who's reading a book like a man sitting there reading a book is not nearly as a woman as a man who's out there building
oh, I see. In terms of
doing
I see in terms of outward accomplishment. See, I was
right.
going to differ with you there a little bit because when I do finish reading a book, I feel like I've completed something. Something as if I've, for example, finished a meal or gotten out of the bath or these various small things. And now granted, it's not a very big like whatever neurotransmitters are involved, it's not a very big hit of any kind of sensational feeling, but it is a sense of completion that I get. Something more like you'd so much rather sneeze than to not be able to sneeze, for example. But nobody considers
Right.
a sneeze an accomplishment. I understand that. So it is kind of with books in the intellectual sphere. It's more like I do sense that I've finished something. And I feel a lingering feeling when I haven't quite yet got to the last page. It almost no matter
Right.
what it is, even if I don't really like the book very much, sometimes I find it harder to quit than to finish. Sometimes it's easier to finish.
And
um,
Paul, that
yeah.
could be forming addiction that way. That feeling you get on the last page of the book could be the addictive measure that keeps you reading. I mean,
Well,
so
you're exactly, you know what one of the things, Indiana man, I think that prevents people from reading is because there are rewards in life, dopaminergic rewards or whatever, endorphin rewards that are so much higher than the feeling you get from simply finishing a book, that they don't really find any satisfaction in reading a book high enough to make sure that they read. There isn't enough motive, enough pull to turn the page.
right.
They'd
And
rather
it
they'd rather veg out on something. They'd rather, I don't know, I don't want to use the terminologies, but let's say substances. They'd rather take substances. They'd rather do certain acts with people, fornicate,
yeah,
some adultery, whatever. Just
yeah.
things
It's
that,
horrible.
but there are definitely, I would say, even having a beer, I'd say, if you're the kind of person who'd like to have a few beers, I can see how that would in some way be more immediately rewarding than finishing a book. And another thing is, a lot of these books are long, man. You're gonna have to go through a lot to finish that sucker, man. I
It,
but the
it,
thing is
Paul,
that I feel more accomplished. It's harder, but I feel more accomplished by reading a longer book. I'm like, I finished something by Theodore Dreiser a few days ago, and I was like, man, that was a long book, but I'm glad I got through it. I feel like and but part of it is I tell myself that, okay, this book was published in 1912. So I'm sure that that was before TV. that was, I think, maybe even before radio was popular. And but radio really, even radio doesn't have nearly as much the pull as TV. So I
Right?
feel like people must have had. I doubt that was a very long book in 1912. In 1912, that was probably just a good read.
Well,
It was like a worthwhile read, you know.
Paul, let me point here. Sadly enough, there are some children who can't sit through an entire episode of Sesame Street. They have that short of an attention span. And so we've developed these children with short attention spans because they can't even pay attention to an hour long television program, not a radio program,
Oh, which
not
is itself highly segmented, mind
yes,
you.
go 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 go.
Yeah.
Hey, if,
Do, 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 do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Do, 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 do. They got
yes,
marbles going all over the place. They got puppets popping out of trash cans and all this.
so it's almost a given that any child who can't even sit through an hour long episode of Sesame Street, sure the hell not going to be able to sit down and read a book. Not of any length like a 1912 Theodore Dreiser book.
Yeah, I don't know how I've come to build up the mental stamina to finish a 1912 Theodore Dreiser book, but I think I looked at the word count and it was something like, I can't remember. Was it almost a million words? It might have
It,
been something like
it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
it was. 1, 2, 3, 4. So this this thing was long, and so reading a book is very good too because I mean, you can also, it's kind of a history lesson because the things that they were doing in 1912 that were adulterous, like they were highly scandalous then, but they were very tame by our quick sensational standards. To have an affair, to have a mistress and things like that you would eventually run away with in 1912 was a very long, involved ordeal. This was, I mean, so this guy uh, eventually did run away with a mistress that I think he met when she was just coming of age and he was like in his 30s or something. And so, and he had a wife and kids and stuff, but eventually he ended up running away with this lady. But it was nothing like, I mean, there was probably more involved with that affair than there is in many of the marriages of today. I bet.
Yes.
Because, yeah, because like we were relating, like how is reading a book bad for your marriage? No, it's almost like reading a long good book just goes along with almost everything else good in life. It seems
Uh,
to
well, Paul, that depends on what book you're talking about and why
well,
it
but
was
even if
written,
it does,
who
even
writes.
even if it's a book that does include adultery or something, it's like because at least you don't, you may not condone it still, but at least you had to read and keep up and see how long and involved this affair that this guy had
Yeah.
was. And you see how controversial and scandalous it was at the time too, and just how against it the people of the time were, that even if it occurs, like nowadays, it's just like I know in our hometown there was some kind of thing going around about the weatherman and the sheriff. If you remember that, okay, I mean that was scandalous, but
But now, and that's nothing by today's standards, Paul. That's today's standards are you go on Tinder and you directly
yeah,
specify want somebody to sleep around with, and the next thing you
yeah.
know, it happens. It's
Or
easy.
or or another reason there just aren't affairs today is because you just don't get married, or
Right.
or if you do, it's like, or if you do get married, it's like, well, it's probably not very deep. Really don't put much into it. Probably,
It's
like I said, probably put less into a given marriage, typical marriage of today than an involved affair of the early
yeah,
last century.
the man has
So,
2.5. Paul, the guy's got 2.5 kids. He has a hobby or two. His wife cleans the house and cooks, and then
oh yeah,
goes.
definitely. Yeah, and women were different then. The relations
Well,
between
no,
men and women. This was before feminism. So
well, but today's society, these women that I mean, I don't know what women do for hobbies in today's society, but maybe they sit around and read books. I don't know.
yeah, that reminds me. That's a good segue. I meant to say before, the only time that I remember seeing a case where somebody yelled, "What did you do when you were in college? Sit around and read books all day?" Or the it was emphasis on the phrase, "What'd you do? Sit around and read books all day?" Highlighting that phrase. The only context I heard that in was when students at the University of Michigan were rioting on campus, starting dumpster fires and bonfires, and basically just going crazy and just rioting and maybe looting or something. I mean, definitely, they were taking off clothes and things like that. Have you heard about that? Maybe,
I don't
yeah. But
know,
it
Paul.
was,
I
but
context you. There's been a lot of riots and especially protests at college campuses. So I
I
don't
think
know
this
which
was in
one
the
you're talking.
90s. No, this was in the 90s, and they were doing it for no reason other
Uh,
than to just not, just wait for it, sit around and read books. If they just read books, they would not have rioted because that is the only
well,
context where I heard somebody yell to the cops. They yelled to the cops who were closing in on these rioters. They were yelling, "What did you do when you were in college? Sit around and read books all day?" Well, kind of, yeah. And what's
yeah,
wrong with that? We didn't riot, and I'm a cop now, and I'm closing
so
in on you. So
Paul, Paul, what you just witnessed there in that little snippet of what did you do? Sit around and read books all day. You just witnessed the actual event of society trying to break down book reading because it's too good.
yeah,
So
exactly. It's too good for society to take. They
they
have
have to.
to crucify it. It's too
Yes,
good. Get it
yeah.
out of here. We don't want it. It makes us look bad.
So
We
now,
don't want to put in the work.
but we were also talking about addictions and how certain activities can get you out of an addiction that uh, some of these addictions can be so simple that harmless, but you can feel so low after taking part in these things that maybe possibly an activity. I think reading is possibly an activity that you could do in between the highs and lows of an addiction to actually balance and level out your mind, chemical hormonal imbalances, your balances, balance
Oh,
out your rebuild, um, and level out again, and that might help. Is a simple thing like drinking a glass of water, reading a book. Does anybody drink water these days? I don't know. The soda companies are so big and so multi-million dollar corporations that they basically control what we drink, and it's soda. I don't know if very many people just drink a plain glass of water anymore.
well,
and
I
and
do, but
has
I
that.
also have a Coke addiction. I do.
Yeah, right. See,
Yeah.
these global corporations have affected everything we do, from reading on down to the water we drink. And we could even get into the topic of thought control or mind control and how AI is going to play into that eventually. But
Oh,
there's so
God.
many things that they're trying to control, like reading, what we drink, what we eat. They're all intertwined. Am I
Yeah,
right?
yeah, definitely. And I wonder so-called campaigns to get kids to read and stuff like that. I wonder how many of them are known to be tongue in cheek or in vain. that they know the kids aren't going to read. I remember when I was in, I think it was seventh grade, um, and if you were in like AP English or whatever, advanced English, at first I remember the teacher saying that at first he assumed that we were reading, and so we didn't have assigned books or anything. We were just concentrating on other lessons. But then it was pretty easy to figure out that we weren't reading. I think maybe we were like the first generation that even among kids that were assumed to be reading anyway, so didn't have to be forced to read, that they actually weren't reading. So they had to be,
Mm.
so all of the kids had to be forced to be reading because even the kids who looked bookish and smart or whatever still weren't reading. So it's like,
So
but
society had already taken over by then.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think so. I think so. And I'm sure having something like Channel One in the schools didn't help kids read. And it didn't,
Yes, all, but how many of those children watched Sesame Street when they were a kid? That's what I wonder.
yeah. I mean, I did. Not much though, not much. And it's weird. It's weird because watching more Sesame Street doesn't really teach you the ABCs that much more. And another thing is when you do watch Sesame Street, there are other things that you're not learning that are valuable that you could be learning in early childhood. Like
Right.
being able to recognize the alphabet, it actually competes with brain territory that's involved in face emotion recognition and things like that. So I'm not sure, like very, very prime. There are things more primal than the alphabet that we that our brains do, faces and things like that our brain kind of areas that our brain hijacks in order to be able to do these higher level things. It kind of hijacks the lower level things. But when you're at Sesame Street age, maybe you shouldn't really be learning the alphabet and counting on TV. Maybe you should be learning emotion on TV. You know,
Exactly. I guess my point is at what point did the short attention span take over? And did it have anything to do with Sesame Street? And then it eventually led
well,
to forcing children to read in school. And
well,
so,
the
what
scary
was
thing
that?
is, Indiana Man, Sesame
Yeah.
Street was just a stepping stone to what we have today. The kids today have TikTok. The kids today
Uh,
basically have the crack of short attention span highs. I mean, these kids, you thought, there's stuff you shouldn't dabble in and stuff. And then there's crack, right? So these kids have cut straight to the crack of mental of stimulation, and it's just so we were basically like what we had in our day. I don't know, maybe there was just a few beers or something relative to what these kids have.
it-
But I mean, not to say it wasn't bad, but it's like, man. So
yeah.
I don't know how it is that I've read books now. I think it's because I lack a lot of stimulation where I am. I'm in the Philippines
Oh,
here, and with not much going on. But
right.
also, but
No,
another thing.
all you all you have the ability to slow down and
Yeah,
take it down, and you don't have the short attention span, and you slow down a little bit, and you're able to look at everything on a different level that's not in a hurry. And when you can do that, I think you go back to what's important in life, and then accomplishments.
I
And
sense that you're starting to you're tapping into that too. I do.
uh
I sense that from you about the activities, the kind of hobbies and stuff.
no, Paul, so much of our society has played a role in my life today, and even on the job. Like our jobs are different.
That's
So
another
my
thing I wanted to mention. Yeah, does
yes, my
jobs just having to work so much does interfere with reading books, right? So, I mean,
yes,
to the extent that it does interfere with reading books, I think as the guidepost, to the extent that it interferes with your ability to read books and enjoyment thereof and to start and finish, is how bad it is. That's how much you're overworking. There's a certain amount of work that's good because that amount of work will actually help you read books. And then the amount of work that's too much work is the amount of work that makes it harder to read books.
Something so basic and so simple, Paul, that I think it really is that I'm still looking for and grasping for another thing to base these addictions and activities in society on. But such a simple thing like sitting down to read a book doesn't matter what the book is about. Even it's just the ability to read that book from start to finish and feel that a feeling of accomplishment. But so many things in our society are they're directed against reading books.
Yeah.
And
even
yeah,
even audiobooks are supposed to be like, oh, it's okay because you don't have the time, or you're on your commute or whatever. I could understand a certain amount of that for sure. If you really absolutely at that time can't be reading a book, but you have the time, audiobooks, fine. But audiobooks just to have an audiobook because you don't want to read it, I mean, that doesn't that do I don't know. I mean, I don't want to sound like too much of a goody two shoes or like I'm judging other people or something, but I still do believe in the guidepost of just judging how good things are in terms of do they help you read books or not? Because it's almost like there's this reading a book is like almost like the pinnacle goodness, other than something like making sure you're loyal to your wife or something. It's like
it's
it's
the
like
simplicity. It's the pinnacle of simplicity. And we don't have that in life anymore. There's nothing simple in life anymore. You have job, you have payments, you have worries and family and so many outside influences. But if you could base that on, does this activity get in the way of my pure simple enjoyment of reading a book? And that would, I think that would be a good basis to rate how healthy or bad an activity is.
anything. Yeah, anything, including relations with your wife versus a woman you shouldn't. Though
Right.
one way you can tell, not this. I mean, I know it's in the Ten Commandments and everything, blah blah blah. But also, one thing the Ten Commandments could have pretty much been summarized into one thing: Thou shalt not do things that make it harder for you to read a book. That's it.
Are you letting your emotions get in the way of you reading a book?
Is it? Yeah. Is it
Yeah.
making it
And
harder?
now,
Because they all do. Every single thing in the Ten Commandments, or anything that you're not supposed to do, it's going to make it harder to read a book. Anything that you're supposed to do,
but Paul,
it's going to
and
make
there's also Paul, other end of the spectrum is writing. It could be
right.
the same thing, right? Because in order to be able to read, you have to have written material. Now, who writes that material? You have to have good material, and you have to be able to write. So, who's writing this stuff? And
Well,
you write?
see if you
Are
read
they
enough books, then you can write books too. See,
right?
I know it had to start somewhere, but typically good writers are good readers.
Yes, and but
Um,
Paul, how many writers are there left in society today?
Not a whole lot of good ones. Not, yeah,
And if
because we don't read.
right, and they go where the money is. They probably go for the magazines and the little snippets and the YouTubes and the TikToks and the short attention span crap. The writers of
Yeah,
today
this has been
have.
great. We've got less than a minute,
Okay,
so I'll
great.
let you wrap it up. Go ahead. And yeah,
Don't do it if it involves too much getting in the way of reading a book. But then reading a book is a good way to defeat the highs and lows of an addiction, and something simple as drinking water, paying